So, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Albert. I would like to focus in the talk on applying the technique of adaptive planning and adaptation pathways to strategic flood risk management. By way of background, my day job is with Jacobs Firm Consulting Engineers. I've worked predominantly in the water sector in about 20 countries internationally. I've looked at, in that time, water resources problems, applying optimization modeling to water systems, as well as integrated flood risk management. And so this is a very brief introduction to a project that I'm working on at the moment, which is piloting the application of adaptation pathways to flood risk management in the UK. And why do we need to adapt? So we need to adapt to climate change, and this is future UK precipitation. Sorry, my pointer is so not working very well. So you can see the general trend, projected trend of precipitation is not only will there be, thank you. Yeah. Not only will generally there be enhanced precipitation in the future, but the variability around precipitation will increase. So climate change projections are associated with deep uncertainties. The importance is not only the degree of change, but also the variability of the extreme events that are associated with the change. And the potential impacts of climate change are therefore not only dynamic, they're potentially very complex because they will affect different interdependent systems, and they're also potentially unstable. They can have potentially unstable consequences. And if you go to any of the talks from the Global Systems Institute, just down the road here, you'll learn about tipping points, global system tipping points, and that is a very good example of potentially very dynamic, highly complex impacts of climate change. In this particular project, we're concerned with the uncertainty around climate change in long-term strategic planning of flood risk management. We need to think in the long term because a lot of infrastructure has a very long working life. We need to allow for the uncertainty and change in the design concepts that we apply and also the design standards. If we over or under-invest in the face of uncertainty, we can create regret. We've either built something that is too big for its purpose, or we've created something that is insufficient for its purpose, and both those can create regret. And if we make poor choices in the short term, we can lead to longer-term situations where we are locked in to a set of circumstances that could be expensive to recover from or to reverse in the future. So, adaptive planning. So, adaptation pathways are built within an adaptive planning process. And I don't know, be interested to know if how many of you have come across the concept of adaptive planning? Yeah, 1 or 2 hands going up. But it's essentially an iterative process incorporating learning via feedback. So the process is well established. You start off with setting the context of the problem. You identify the risks and opportunities around climate change. You formulate options for implementing responses. If you've got a series of alternative options, you then in the green box here evaluate them. And then you start developing what we call adaptation pathways, and these are coherent sequences of responses into the longer term. So typically a design horizon for an adaptive planning study is between 50 to 100 years. The adaptation options are then implemented. Having implemented them, their impact is then monitored and evaluated, and you can see that there are feedback loops shown in green lines and black dotted lines within the system. And the most important is it's iterative, so you don't have to get it right first time, and you learn from it. So the generation of insight is as important as the process itself. And it is used in planning in the face of change and uncertainty. It looks at risk thresholds. It looks at future decision points, points at which you will have to make a decision about adaptation responses. It plans sequences of actions, and it monitors the changes and outcomes. And this framework enables you then to start developing adaptation pathways. So what are adaptation pathways? As we implement any infrastructure system, there will come a point indicated by the red triangle where the performance of the system is no longer adequate. And then there'll be alternative options. What do we do then? So, for example, we've got a flood defense system, and the flood defenses are at this level. They start becoming overtopped more frequently than people are comfortable with. So you have to make a decision. Do we raise the flood defenses? Do we invest in property resilience measures? Do we move the people away if we can't raise the flood defenses anymore because of cost or technical problems? So at each decision point, there are potential ways forward, and each of those ways forward will then encounter another decision point further into the future. So we're concerned with a long-term view of planning where we start exploring these different routes into the future. So we follow the blue route, as shown on this diagram, or at some stage move to the green route, or do we very early on move to an alternative route? And what we're looking for are robust sequences of actions. Now, what do we mean by robust? They're actions that work well across a range of future scenarios. So we're looking for robustness. We're looking to improve resilience, but also adaptive capacity. And what I mean by adaptive capacity is the ability to improve a piece of infrastructure incrementally. For example, if I were to want to build an earth embankment to contain flooding, if I think adaptively, I'll buy more land now than I need for the first embankment, so that in the future, if I have to raise the embankment, and we'll assume it's an earth embankment, I've already acquired the land on which to extend the base of the embankment to be able to raise it incrementally. So we're looking for that adaptive capacity. We want to prepare for tipping points. Coastal engineering is full of very good examples of tipping points where you get accelerated coastal erosion, meaning that it is highly likely at some stage in the future coastal defense measures will become prohibitively expensive and therefore unaffordable, and maybe now is the time to start talking about the possibility of relocating a community before quite literally the land on which their houses are built tips into the oceans. And adaptation can range from small autonomous actions, by that I mean actions that individuals take, to incremental actions that may be planned, and some of the planned actions could be highly transformational. Adaptation pathways are generally used in three main areas. One is in performance-led adaptation, where the emphasis is very engineering focused. You predict a set of future conditions, and then you act, you design something to deal with them. It's all about not crossing certain thresholds, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But there are also policy-led adaptation pathways where people imagine a range of future scenarios, and I'll show you an example of this, where you then imagine how you will get from the state we are now to some sort of set of future conditions. These future conditions are long-term destinations, and often these policy pathways start looking at the implications of transformational adaptation. And also, stakeholder consultation is very important in the whole process of adaptation planning, because you need to integrate different stakeholders in the process. And so pathways, you need also a set of pathways or route maps that encourage stakeholder participation and collaboration. So I'm just going to move to a more specific application, and that is the application of adaptation pathways to flood and coastal erosion management. So my interest in this area goes back 15 years. Back in 2006, 2007, we developed a set of adaptation pathways for the River Thames estuary. And the crucial concept was that you have an acceptable level of flood risk, and that's this threshold here. And that in time, under the influence of climate change and land use development, flood risk will rise. And the rate at which flood risk rises, the diagram here shows 3 different rates, 3, 2, and 1. At the highest rate, you've got flood risk rising not only because water levels are rising, but also because you've got expansion and development on the floodplain. And it's the combination of flooding and receptor damage that gives us the measure of flood risk. And there may be also a loss of effectiveness in the infrastructure you've already got there. So under the worst case, you get the most rapid rise in flood risk if you've got aging infrastructure, a desire for development, and rising water levels. And then at each decision points, and here you see decision points A and B, you have to decide, how do we bring back down the level of flood risk to something that is more acceptable? So the process is one of tracking the potential change in flood risk, but before you reach that threshold, to implement an action or a set of actions that helps you manage that risk, knowing that in the future that level of flood risk may rise again, because most of the indicators we have around climate change are that fluvial flood risk is going to rise in Britain. The frequency and severity of extreme flood events generally are set to rise. At coastal locations, the argument is much clearer, because sea levels are rising and set to rise. Even if we switch off greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, the residual effect in Earth systems will mean sea level rise will continue for a long time into the future. So the output of this initial work was the Thames Estuary 2100 Flood Risk Management Strategy. I don't know how many of you have been to London, to the tidal part, the Thames Estuary. I mean, in the background, on the slide, you can see Canary Wharf, but the biggest, most significant flood defence structure is the Thames Barrier. And the Thames Barrier is probably the best bit of investment that people have made in Britain in terms of hydraulic infrastructure, because it has protected London from flooding. But I'll say a bit more about that later. But just to explain a little bit about this illustration of the flood defense options. You've got an existing flood defense system at the left-hand side of the diagram. The first step is you can start raising flood defenses. But then there's a limit in some areas to the extent to which you can raise flood defenses. Sometimes people just don't want to live behind flood defenses that keep going up. Other times there may be engineering issues. So you also have to use the Thames barrier to limit the incursion of higher storm surges from the Channel, from the North Sea. And this involves over-rotating the Thames barrier. It's got inherent flexibility in it, which enables it to deal with storm surges now that were not anticipated 30 years ago when the Thames barrier was first built. So you've got a combination of over-rotating the barrier, but also incrementally improving flood defences. And the question we were asking is, what if the maximum water level rises by up to 4 meters? Now, those of you familiar with sea level rise projections will know that by the end of the century, the projected rise is between 75 centimeters, possibly a meter under the worst scenarios for the Thames estuary. Globally, these values vary quite significantly from location to location. So why were we asking what would happen if sea level rises was as high as 4 meters? The answer was we wanted to check how robust our set of initial flood defense improvements would be under a high sea level rise of 4 meters. And the answer was, inevitably, for anything above 2.5 meters, you probably need a new tidal barrier further down in the Thames estuary. And this is now part of the long-term strategy. However, you can't create a new tidal barrier in 5 or 10 years. The planning process is of the order of 30 years. So we have to start thinking now about planning for the new barrier. And that is one of the big advantages of taking this long-term planning horizon and considering sequences of coherent actions. So the lines through this diagram have all been carefully thought through, underpinned by modelling, investigations, and they're, if you like, a route map into the future. And I just wanted to show you that when the Thames barrier was first commissioned in 1982, look, it was used once every 2 or 3 years. More recently, it's been used several times a year. In 2013, 2014, it was used over 40 times. So that is the practical impact of climate change. I talked about using pathways as guides to help stakeholder engagement. This is the same diagram that I've just shown you, but it's presented in a much more visually appealing way that is easier to understand. So you've got sea level rising along the right-hand axis, and as sea level rises, you've got these transitions between improving the existing barrier, adding in the middle part of the century, augmenting the barrier with flood storage, and ultimately building a new barrier further downstream in the estuary. So my particular project that I'm currently involved in is one for the River Severn Partnership, and it's part of an adaptation pilot program being funded by the Environment Agency, and it has, at the time I prepared the slide, it had 3 focus areas. It's now got 5 focus areas, but these are geographically different. So the Humber is the River Humber estuary up in the northeast of England, and the emphasis of the Humber pilot project is very much stakeholder engagement across multiple stakeholder groups, and how do you develop, what tools do you need to develop to help that? The OxCam was very much around optimizing the investment in flood defences, envisaging a new high-tech corridor of living and working between the cities of Oxford and Cambridge. And the emphasis on that pilot project was the optimal planning of optimal levels of investment in flood risk management. The River Severn Partnership is about unlocking regional growth. So it's about prosperity through resilience. The idea is that if you can show to people that the area in which they live or might want to live or work is resilient to flooding well into the future, and you can demonstrate the strategic plans in place to do this, then you will unlock prosperity because people will have confidence in living and investing in that area. So each of these projects, I should say, are at the beginning of a 3-year endeavour, stretching from now to 2027, to develop these different aspects of adaptation pathways. I included this slide because I felt maybe some of you are not that familiar with flood resilience measures. They're very specific to their location, so you can reduce runoff in river catchments to create local storage and reduce flood peak flows. You can store water on the river floodplains. A lot of river floodplains, unfortunately, have been built on, but where there is opportunity to store water, that is another option. You've got land management to reduce rainfall runoff and improve infiltration. You've got sustainable urban drainage systems that many of you in the room will be familiar with. Then you can improve the hydraulic capacity of the river channel itself through erosion protection and dredging. You've then got flood defence systems. That's the most traditional form of dealing with flooding. But nowadays, much increasing interest is being drawn towards improving the flood resilience of houses and buildings. And then along the bottom, you've got flood warnings and community resilience, and then improved drainage from hard permeable surfaces to reduce flood peaks. But it's very rare that a single measure is implemented on its own. So here in this graphic we can see we can either reduce the peak water level in the river, and that's called load reduction, or we can create a flood defence embankment, and that stops the water physically getting onto the land that you want to protect from flooding. You can, and that results in exposure reduction. But I think the person that drew this diagram reminded us that there is residual flooding, that even though you've got flood embankments, you can still experience flooding. That's why that poor cow is standing there with very wet feet. And essentially adaptation may need a mix of different interventions. And the challenging question is, what is the best mix? What is the best portfolio of interventions? So one way of analysing it is to think of different types of intervention. So this is, the examples I'm giving now are related to performance-related pathways, where you have some sort of threshold of acceptable risk, and you've got time and level of flood risk. And so we could reach a decision point. Doesn't show up very well, but the first red triangle is the first decision point, beyond which we could either improve the storage in the catchment, that might be one thing to do. Or we could, the yellow line is improve the resilience of buildings on the floodplain, or we could build linear defences. And each of those interventions will deal with, it'll reduce flood risk to an acceptable level over a particular period of time in the future. So clearly, if we build linear defences, we have security for much longer, perhaps, than catchment storage interventions. And we can simplify the problem by saying, if we treat each of these as alternatives, we can set up a decision tree where we either first invest in catchment storage and then property resilience followed by linear defences. And that's the pathway up at the top. Or we can do, we can invest in catchment storage and follow it by linear defences and property resilience. So there are different permutations of interventions. And at its simplest level, the decision-making problem becomes one of applying costs and benefits to each of those branches and saying, well, which of those branches gives us the most economically efficient solution? But this is a highly simplified graphic because for two reasons. One is the threshold of acceptable flood risk changes with time. So that dotted red line will move with time. The second is that usually these are not alternatives, but they are parts of a portfolio of interventions. And even if you keep them separate, you very quickly run into the curse of dimensionality, where I've shown 4 interventions here: catchment flood storage, floodplain storage, temporary flood defences, permanent flood defences. And you've got multiple decision points emerging. And the timing, what we're really interested in is the timing of those decision points, potentially. Because we want to say there's a decision coming up that means the flood risk will need to be managed. Do we have enough time to respond? And how does that condition our response? So the timing of these future decision points depends not only on the actions that are being taken, it also depends on the uncertainty in the projected peak flood levels. So you've got those 2 blue dotted lines. Those are based on uncertain projections, and it changes with time. And then, having accepted dimensionality, you've then got to deal with the practicalities of implementing. And by that I mean taking into account the lead time for implementing a flood risk management measure. So, if the indicator, which is the blue line in the bottom left-hand corner, lies below the trigger value, then you can say that indicator is approaching a trigger value. That is a signal that we might have to start thinking about adaptation. If the indicator is between the trigger value and the threshold value, that means we need to be adapting because we're approaching a threshold, but we want to allow ourselves sufficient time to implement the adaptation measure. And that's where, in the adaptive planning cycle, the monitoring and evaluation becomes very important, because having set out a set of pathways and identified the parameters you need to model, you then have to integrate the modeling and evaluation of those parameters with some sort of strategy, risk management strategy. And when the indicator value has reached the threshold, you hope by then to have implemented a flood risk management intervention or set of interventions to manage that risk. So all these ideas we're trying to bring together into the River Severn region. And so this is a template for the prospective flood risk planner faced with larger, more frequent flood events with time. what sort of interventions do you consider? And we've got a range of interventions down the left-hand side, from nature-based solutions to traditional flood defences to asset relocation. It may well be that you then have to say, I'm sorry, we can't manage this risk in perpetuity. We have to think of relocating assets. And what sort of pathways between those different interventions might exist? So what I've drawn up is purely hypothetical, because in actual practice, to determine the length of influence of each intervention, you have to underpin that with extensive monitoring. But you can look for not only the physical risk outcomes of reducing flood risk and improving resilience, but co-benefits as well. So nature-based solutions are receiving quite a lot of interest at the moment, and one of the reasons for that is the co-benefits of improving biodiversity, improving water quality, and acting as a sink for carbon dioxide. So what sort of insight have we gained so far? We've established that adaptation pathways and adaptive planning encourages a long-term view in planning. It tries to avoid lock-in to situations that might be foreseeable, and it avoids the temptation of perhaps taking too short a perspective on adaptation in flood risk management. It considers multiple future scenarios. A lot of engineering infrastructure is designed on the basis of a single preferred scenario. This introduces the idea of multiple scenarios and acts as a vehicle for identifying robustness. And it tries to integrate a range of adaptation actions, from the incremental to the transformative. The benefits are it's an iterative process that feeds learning and insight back into it. The pathways can be drawn as route maps in ways that can help engage with stakeholders. And alternative pathways can help identify the trade-offs between policies and actions in public discourse. The challenges are that these are potentially complex. There are potentially complex interactions between systems that can create big problems, and usually we need portfolios of responses. Risk thresholds can be dynamic. And lastly, but very importantly, evaluating the benefits of adaptation requires innovative forms of economic appraisal. A little bit of an overseas aspect of this. So I've been applying the concept of adaptive planning and adaptation pathways to coastal resilience investment in Singapore, and more recently in the UK, we've been looking at coastal locations, because at the end of the day, it's those coastal locations that are probably the most vulnerable in terms of their exposure to and impacts of climate change. And we do this work, we're doing this work not in isolation, but it is being catalyzed by the setting of standards and the raising of awareness. So the International Standards Organization in 2019 published a standard on adapting to climate change, ISO 40090, and I was fortunate to have been invited to be part of the drafting committee for that. British Standard in 2021 looked specifically at adaptation pathways, and I was a member of the group that drafted that standard. In the background, we've got the Committee on Climate Change, reporting to Parliament every 5 years, drawing attention to the scale and ambition in implementing adaptation in the UK. This is catalysed by the Climate Change Act 2008, which requires the UK government to publish a climate change risk assessment every 5 years. The last one was 2021, University of Exeter played a very significant role in drafting that document and continues to do so in the next incarnation, which will be the climate change risk analysis 4, which I think is due out in 2 years' time or something. And then, of course, internationally, as you know, COP27 and COP28 have indicated a growing awareness of the importance of adaptation. And issues like loss and damage, and who funds both the loss and damage side of things and the adaptation side of things. And that is my last slide, so I've finished with a minute to spare. But I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Any question from the audience? Barry?
Thank you. I was just wondering about, with the adaptation pathways, about like spatial considerations. So if you're planning for your catchment a certain set of pathways, say, how will the implications of your changes influence neighbouring catchments? Or are they like considered, or do you know?
No, that's a very good question, and that is one of the reasons the River Severn Basin has been selected for this pilot programme, because you've got 7 catchment, the Team catchment, the Warwickshire Avon catchment, so you've got these different catchments with different priorities, and something that we're looking for is an appreciation of these interdependencies, so that on the positive side, you're identifying response that creates synergy between different catchments, but also on the wish to avoid unforeseen consequences side, you want to demonstrate that careful thought has been given to these interdependencies. But it all adds to the complexity of the situation. But it's on our radar. Yeah.
I pick up first. Oh, sorry.
So you mentioned the difference between like the trigger points and then like where it actually crosses the threshold, and you want to have that adaptation implemented. And so thinking about like different projects that you would be implementing as adaptations, taking like sort of different amounts of time. So, like one project might take 5 years, another project might take 30 years. How did setting the trigger points take account?
Because it may then signal the need to take a decision earlier, decision on the second barrier earlier than previously anticipated. But you only get to that observation if you commit yourself to this iterative review and re-evaluation. And I think the group in the UK that does this very well now, under regulatory pressure, are water utilities. So every 5 years they re-evaluate the water resources plan, and they're essentially implementing an adaptive planning process.
Yes. Well, I wonder whether you maybe answered my question before I asked it, but I was going to say it seems like the adaptive planning is very, very context specific. Yeah. So there might be a framework that works well across multiple contexts, but certainly not one approach. But do you have any other examples of particularly good approaches that you could highlight that we could have a look at?
Yeah, they tend... So in the water utilities sector, there are emerging water resources plans that are adaptive. And that's partly because Ofwat has said, we want you to, in your long-term delivery strategies, to consider different scenarios, a long time horizon, and develop a set of adaptation pathways for different types of future. And so I've been working with one water utility to produce that, and they've done some really good work, drawing even on ideas of regret analysis, etc., and they submit it to the regulator, and the regulator scratches their head and says, it's a bit complicated, isn't it? So I think the examples are they're emerging examples in the literature. They're more the academic literature than the practical literature, because I think we're all trying to learn as quickly as we can. But, I mean, even this stuff is not written up anywhere yet. It's all so. But I think there are interesting papers emerging from Australia, from New Zealand. They seem to have the city of Christchurch on the South Island in New Zealand is developing a community-led adaptation strategy, and it involves not only the city of Christchurch but the coastal community. So issues around sea level rise and potential possible relocation are becoming very topical. I don't know, that's a bit of a rambling answer, James.
It was a bit of a rambling question, so that's fine.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I ask a follow-up question? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
We have a couple online questions. So
Okay.
yes, we have more audience than in this room.
Okay.
Online. So that's the first question. Is there any guidance currently in development as a part of EES research and R&D work about the lead-in times for different interventions to act as building blocks for flood risk managers and others to use to roll this approach out more widely?
Not formal guidance, as far as I'm aware. There's informal guidance, so cohorts of professionals will have some view as to how long it takes to implement certain projects. So there are rules of thumb, but it's very context specific, and it also depends on the planning rules. And I think in Britain at the moment, part of the concern is that the planning rules are slowing down some of the interventions. But I think it's worth waiting to be researched, is the simple answer.
Thank you. The second question, I'm just curious if there was any benchmarking done relative to other similar projects approached on your projects and what items were spent.
So the benchmarking will emerge through the Environment Agency Adaptation Pathways Pilot Program. There are two more projects that I didn't mention on my slides. One is the review of the Thames Estuary 2100 strategy. The other is flood risk management in South Yorkshire, which is a mixture of fluvial and urban flood risk management. And part of the program, this 3 to 4 year program, one of the ambitions is that it will create a sharing of expertise, and emerging from that a set of benchmarks, which then future flood risk planners and managers can use to indicate best practice.
And the third question, is there a vision in the UK for counterbalancing the demurral decisions in terms of building new areas? When building impermeable surface, is there promotion for the development of an equivalent highly permeable surface, such as forest or a certain type?
Yeah, again, I think that's a very topical question, because the Environment Agency is very interested. There's growing interest in nature-based solutions, which it sees not only as catchment management, so solutions, I think there is a nature-based endeavour on Dartmoor, being promoted by South West Water and the Environment Agency, to improve the management of runoff and the landscape on Dartmoor. But the other aspect of nature-based solutions is flood storage, riparian habitats, riparian woodlands and grasslands. And a lot of these areas, again, it's a question now of identifying those areas that could be used and then preventing the development of houses or permanent infrastructure. And that is now written into the planning process. So the potential use of an area for flood risk management can be sufficient to remove it from land designated for, say, housing development. And that's fairly recent. So I think there's a growing, the momentum is gathering behind nature-based solutions. But again, I think there's further research required, because at the end of the day, it's a trade-off. What you're saying is, we're designating this to be the preferred land use because of its beneficial effects on flooding, but we're then, I mean, if you're in the River Severn, for example, there are rural agricultural communities that the floodplain land is very fertile, so you need some sort of a hybrid, such as the use of temporary flood storage washlands, which sort of straddle the nature-based storage concept and something that is a bit more managed for the benefit of others as well.
Thank you. Bias, do you want to ask a question?
Well, I gave it, but
Yes.
there is a enabling thought again here. Okay, this is kind of the process. Can we make it, or can we explore making it kind of a silver bullet in terms of validating it by means of some big casting of what has been happening with the planning processes over the years before, and then see how it rotates. Just validating before and then convincing more. This may be the way forward.
So that's using historic,
Yeah.
the understanding of historic.
Yeah. The decision making in historical terms with the
Yes.
major resource and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I think the historical process was one thing that characterized two things. I think one is single scenario planning and short-term thinking. So often the historical planning process looked for a simple solution that was cost-effective and probably lost sight of the broader physical context. So linear defences that confine a river channel, in retrospect, we'd probably say historically that wasn't the right thing to do. And I think along the River Rhine, for example, in certain areas, they've been renaturalising the river and they've been putting back the flood defences. So in terms of historical attitudes, I think we can learn something about what works well, but also what planning processes led us to be locked in. When I mentioned locked in, a lot of the examples in the literature are about ideas that seemed very good at the time. But now you think, well, if I knew what I knew now, I wouldn't. I don't know, did I answer the question?
I think it opens up new discussion.
Okay.
Okay, James, do you want to follow up?
It's okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for the presentation. My question is regarding the financial feasibility of these. Moving forward, would it be ideal to design new hydraulic infrastructure which is resilient to climate change, or else use the current design procedures and then use these adapting strategies whenever necessary? Which one would be an ideal pathway moving forward?
I think that's a very good question. The former one is build big, and with the intention of dealing with all the future eventualities. The counter-argument to that is that when you do in Britain, for example, for investment in flood defences, you have to show economic efficiency.
Yes.
And that would fail the economic efficiency test. So the one that passes the test more readily is the incremental adaptive pathway. However, you need a commitment to the funding of incremental improvements. Now, with the water utilities, the problem of financing is relatively, I'm not saying it's insignificant, that would be wrong, but the financing comes from you and I, the user of, the consumers of water, and if the water utilities need to invest, they will increase water charges. But with public investment in things like flood defence, you've got to show economic efficiency. So I think what we're hoping will emerge from this sort of work is that flood defence programmes are seen as long-term capital investment programmes rather than single intervention projects. And then ensuring that the funding of that programme can be safeguarded. And that is particularly important now in some coastal locations. Because in some coastal locations, people are worried that the incremental approach won't be funded long enough. And the single big intervention is too expensive. And so there is a debate around that issue. It's a very technical issue. Very good question.
Final question?
Yes, and I noticed that the threshold is very important for our decision making and adaptive planning, but there are increasingly phenomena that break through threshold, such as the extreme participation under climate change background. But if we set a very high threshold, it maybe means more the resource waste, and the low threshold may means the increased risk. So is there any possible strategy or approach to help us to identify appropriate threshold to help us decision making?
I think that's another very good question, because a lot of transformational adaptation tries to detach the dependence on the threshold. So, for example, the Global Centre for Adaptation in the Netherlands is a floating office building. And they're making a statement there. They're saying, our building will rise as sea levels rise, the building will rise. We're no longer, we moved the threshold from one of stop water affecting us to saying, we will accept that water, we will live with the variability. It creates different thresholds, such as you've got to then design the building to be functional as the water level rises. So you've then got to think, it's a different set of design problems. But that is a way of trying to move away from the idea of a fixed threshold. The other one is, earlier I mentioned that that good adaptive investments usually cover a portfolio of interventions. So you remember the slide with the cow, with the cow's feet in water? Well, that's a reminder that we've got to think in terms of the resilience of buildings on the floodplain, as well as thresholds related to flood defence levels, flood embankment levels. So you're replacing one threshold with two thresholds. One is the resilience of the buildings, and the second is the resilience of the threshold, the primary flood defence structure itself. So that's, again, it requires a different approach to the concept of thresholds. I think there'll be, in practice, there are multiple thresholds. Of course, it makes the problem more complicated, because multiple thresholds mean multiple investment opportunities, and hence the importance of stakeholder engagement. And my bottom line is, a lot of this work, I think, reminds me that as an engineer, if we're able to integrate across different sectors and domains and resolve trade-offs and understand something about the economics, then we can contribute, we can add significant value to the process, because at the end of the day, as engineers, we understand the technical limitations of what we're proposing. But it's to get involved in the broader debate that makes this a very interesting area in which to work. Thank you. Thank you. Very patient.
Thank you very much again, and also thanks for those who joined us online. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all the questions.
Yeah.
So, but you should be able to find out, if just let me know if you need to get in touch with Peter, and we will get in touch with you.
Please do. Yeah.
Thank you again. And next week will be back to here again, so I will make sure we don't delay next week. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you very much.